Hello and welcome to the sixth in our Zero In series with me, Sai Kamal, the Academic and Research Director at the Institute of Economic Affairs in London. Now, in this series, we've previously been joined by Kingsmill Bond, Professor Richard Toll, Dr. Jamie White, Professor Philip Booth, and Bruno Pryor. And in each interview, we've had thought-provoking and insightful discussions about an array of issues around the environmental agenda. We've touched upon the issues of Pigouvian taxes, on negative externalities, to renewable energy, to the fundamental question of whether targets are necessary or achievable. For example, is net zero carbon achievable by 2050? And is it really the best way to clean up our planet? What are the free market solutions? What policy levers could be pulled? Now, today I'm very pleased to be joined by Rod Richardson, President of the Grace Richardson Fund, and also of the Clean Capitalist Leadership Council. Rod, thank you very much for joining us. Before we come on to your work at the Clean Capitalist Leadership Council, could we just discuss initially, I know we may want to come back to this, climate change and coronavirus, whether you see any resemblance between the two crises, how do they interact, why do you think there's been such public willingness to sacrifice modern luxuries for coronavirus, but not necessarily climate change? And what do we make of the fact that even under lockdown, that the International Energy Agency expects global industrial greenhouse gas emissions to be just 8% lower in 2020 than in 2019? I know that's an awful lot of questions, but I just wanted to set the scene, as it were.
Sure. Yeah, I think that there's an obvious connection between them, and that is that they are both examples of massively catastrophic negative externalities that arise from ordinary human behavior, right? And the key difference is the time frame and the intensity is compressed for coronavirus, right? And there is no, we have more time with climate to, have refined policy responses to mitigate and prevent. There is no opportunity to use fine tuning to prevent coronavirus. The only real response we have available is more or less lockdown, right away, though some countries have been able to take slightly different paths with respect to that, with testing and things like that. But basically, the shutdown of normal human behavior, of social interaction, is one way to cure the problem. You could apply that to climate change, but if you shut down normal, human interaction, we see the consequences, which is massive economic dislocation and the very real possibility that many, many people will suffer. And in other parts of the world, perhaps it may get so severe that you see people dying from the economic consequences of this. So it's so that's the first similarity. The second similarity is that in terms of how to get out of these catastrophes and recover from them, to my mind, the economic answer, at least, is very similar, and that is economic recovery from a crisis. The initial response to a crisis usually are things like bank lending and spending programs and things like that, which is what we're doing. But when you get to the recovery phase, when you're going beyond, mitigating the damage, preventing damage, you have to go to free market streamlining, right? This is, for instance, what they did in Germany post-World War II. Get rid of the price controls, free up your economy, and the countries, unfortunately, like the UK and France and Italy, that stuck with price controls and rationing and with more Keynesian approaches than Germany did, fared much worse. So the way out of this, to me, is going to be free market streamlining, where you're really trying to make your economy as efficient as possible, getting rid of the barriers to harmless, beneficial activities. So you have to think about what those activities are that really are harmless and beneficial in the coronavirus context. for instance, one of the early responses that we figured out in the States along these lines is that, hey, we have to drop these silly regulations about, what healthcare professionals can practice in what state, and, drop all, there were tons of ridiculous regulations at the FDA, with PP&E, trade barriers and things like that to PP&E. Getting rid of the barriers to things that are harmless and beneficial are, a key to overcoming it. And as we move into the recovery phase, streamlining the economy will be incredibly important, because we cannot, given the amounts of debt that governments are taking on, in my view, they cannot afford, inefficiencies. They can't afford the old subsidy models. They can't afford, the pork. They have to streamline, and we have to think about ways to get rid of negative externalities, get rid of inefficiencies, to make our economy to make those free markets as productive as possible. So that's going to be key. And now I'd like to just put a pin in that and, come back at the end of the discussion to drill into what some of those coronavirus policies are that I'd recommend, because really a lot of that is keyed off of our work with clean free market policy, and so after I explain that, it will be clear what I think we might do with coronavirus.
Of course, and actually we will come on, of course I will ask you about the clean free market proposals, but before I do that, I just want to touch on something you just mentioned there about negative externalities. In previous episodes of this series, we've discussed the Pigouvian tax as a decarbonisation tool. For those who aren't familiar with Pigouvian taxes, it's simply a tax on negative externalities. What are your views in the context of, say, reducing carbon emissions?
Well, I think that, a Pigouvian tax is perfectly good theoretical economics. The problem is that it's theoretical economics. In terms of carrots and sticks, it's economics from the point of view of the rider, not the horse, right? The rider thinks, oh my gosh, beating this horse with a stick is a wonderful way to control this horse. And the horses think, we prefer the carrots. And the trouble is, in a democracy, and especially in places like the United States, I don't know how it is in Europe, but our horses vote. Okay, our workhorses vote, and they have a lot of power, and they really don't like being beaten with sticks. So there's a lot of political, if you're going to lead with, that's one problem. But the other problem is that it's not really free market policy. It is less free market policy, because basically what you're doing is you're imposing, free market policy, real free market policy is laissez-faire, and that was first articulated by a businessman, not an economist. Not somebody who's thinking about riding on top of the economy and how do I control this economy. This was Monsieur Legendre speaking to Monsieur Colbert. What can we do to support French industry in 1681? Laissez-nous faire. Let us do. So that is Monsieur Legendre was a workhorse. He was, and his point of view was, let us work. So, when you start to tax people, you impose, you take, money is to some extent people's freedom. The more money they have, the more choices they have. So when you take their money, you're reducing their freedom. And so that is, it's actually less free market. You're imposing barriers. And, at Grace Richardson Fund, we have a mission, to innovate policy, but we have a design constraint. And that design constraint is we want to expand freedom. So we look at policies that reduce barriers, tax, trade, and regulatory barriers. We don't look at, we don't spend our time developing policies that increase barriers. And, I believe that, if you go in for policies that increase barriers, they may look theoretically like they work, but in fact, they introduce all kinds of distortions. By creating barriers to freedom, you actually create these odd distortions, you know, and for instance, with the carbon tax, there are far more, theoretically it should work, theologically it seems like it should work. We're taxing the sinners. My gosh, it's like, you know, the Puritans' wet dream, you know, like we're going to punish these sinners with a tax. But so it's very appealing to a certain mindset. But in fact, you know, what we find is that there is, you know, the real reason that, you know, we're not getting this, you know, the problem is we're not seeing the substitution effect that we would like from a carbon tax. And the reason is that we have a very inelastic, you know, demand for fossil fuels. And we have very inelastic demand for fossil fuels because there are barriers to that substitution effect. There are monopoly barriers, political barriers, technological barriers that make it really difficult for that substitution to happen. So when you have that situation, you have to have that inelasticity means you have to have a really high carbon tax to have any effect. So the disconnect is that, as some of your previous, you know, folks were talking about, they were saying, well, you know, theoretically, we need to take the social cost of carbon and apply that as a tax. But guess what? That social cost of carbon won't produce the effect you want, because you're going to apply that. You're going to, you know, make the, you know, the economy bear that burden of the social cost of carbon, but you're not going to get the substitution effect you want at that price. So you're going to end up paying the social cost of carbon twice, right? So that's why, you know, in effect, it's much better to, you know, first make sure you've gotten rid of all the barriers to that substitution effect, which is what clean free market policy does. Clean free market policy looks at the barriers to the substitution effect and targets the barriers directly. You know, you get rid of the barriers, and then probably, you know, we'll get to this. You may, by just removing the barriers, you may have done enough so that you have acceleration of these technologies and industries that are solutions. But if you need to impose a carbon tax at that point, the carbon price, that's the effective carbon price, will be much closer to the social cost of carbon. It'll be, you know, it'll be lower and more effective once the barriers are gone. The substitution can affect easier. So that's my take on, you know, why the carbon tax. You know, it's not the worst idea in the world. You know, it certainly is you know, I think that there's a place for fuel taxes, you know, and road taxes and things like that, user fees. It certainly, you know, these things can be revenue raisers, but to rely on it as a single standalone policy to you know, cure climate change is a fantasy. You know, it's not going to happen. And there's a lot of, I mean, I've only, you know, this is just the tip of the iceberg for, you know, the unreality of the, you know, I mean, there's lots of unreality. You know, one of the main claims is that, oh, we're not picking winners and losers, right? Well, that's a complete fantasy. I mean, they're obviously picking losers, and they're having trouble figuring out which losers to pick, because, you know, it's not just fossil fuels, it's farming and cows, and, you know, and how do you, like, you know, which losers are we going to pick, and how bureaucratic do we get, and how complicated does it get, and how many unintentional losers do we, you know, add into this, like the poor folks that, you know, have to drive their cars more and heat their homes, you know. So there are intended and unintended losers, and then there are people supporting this who are really supporting it because, you know, hey, they're going to be a winner, you know. You know, when a renewable energy guy says, you know, I don't favor subsidies, but, you know, I favor the carbon tax, and gee, I'm not picking winners and losers. Well, you know, he's picking a winner, and that's himself.
I do want to come on to the clean free market and clean tax cuts. But before I do that, isn't one of the issues with the carbon tax that really it's just seen as another tax and it goes to general revenue? Of course, unless you are a complete anarcho-capitalist, you believe governments should raise some money and the governments do have to levy taxes. And all that happens with most green taxes or environmental taxes, it just really goes into the general pot of government spending. It doesn't really go towards tackling the environmental issue. Is a better way, maybe, or to get more support for these pecuniary taxes, maybe to make sure it's revenue neutral, so there are offset other tax cuts, for example?
Well, I think that again, theoretically, revenue neutrality makes a lot of sense. But, people really argue about how that revenue neutrality should be achieved. Should it be, for instance, the carbon tax movement has gained a lot of traction because of the endorsement by Arthur Laffer, the guy who, named the Laffer curve.
Yes.
Came out with a paper with Wayne Weingarten, supporting a carbon tax and saying, okay, a consumption tax is less distortionary than, a investment tax. So if you keep investment taxes low and raise the carbon tax, and that's how you achieve revenue neutrality, that's a good trade-off. And there's a good argument for that. It's not a terrible argument, but then again, there are people who say, well, okay, but we need to do something for the poor folks that are paying all these gas taxes. So let's do a dividend. So let's not do the income tax. Let's do the dividend. And then there are people who say, okay, let's do the social justice, more welfare payments, so we need more environmental justice. So you see in places like Washington State where they try to impose a carbon tax, several times. Each time the effort completely fell apart because people on the left who should have been supporting a carbon tax ended up getting into brawls over, how are we going to make this revenue neutral? What are we going to spend the money on? It became a festival of rent seeking on the question of what do we do with the revenue? So the idea that this, the carbon tax proposal doesn't pick winners and losers is a complete fantasy when it comes to how it plays out in the real world. Yeah.
So let's move on. Let's talk about, actually, I know these are issues that you really do want to talk about, the clean free market and clean tax cuts, and about your work at the Clean Capitalist Leadership Council. Could you tell viewers and listeners a bit more about these concepts?
Sure. These ideas are, an opportunistic application of laissez-faire. And the opportunism comes in because there really has been a shift in the economy, in the clean energy economy, over the last decade. Literally between 2011 and 2015, both wind and solar in the United States, at least, I don't know whether it's the same dates are true in the UK, but in the United States, in general, wind and solar crossed this tipping point of being lower cost than fossil fuels by the measure of LCOE. So you can see that if you go back to the Lazard LCOE studies, going back to, they did them every year. You could see those prices going down, going down, going down. By 2015, they were both lower. So at least by the measure of LCOE, which doesn't necessarily take into account all costs, but by that measure, these things had become profitable, which means that in the best sited locations where there weren't huge transmission issues, these things were more profitable and competitive than fossil fuel, right? So when that's the case, that means that all of the policy paradigms that have come before that are now kind of out the window, because all of the subsidies and carbon taxes and all are you know, based on this idea that you must have, you know, these are fundamentally unprofitable technologies, and that you must have some price adjustment mechanism for them to work at all, right? So you need a subsidy to make them profitable, or you need to beat down the price of the carbon for these things to even work at all, right? But now that's not the case. These things will work if they can compete. So once they can compete, the most important thing to do is to let them compete, right? And the anti-competitive barriers in markets are the most important barriers. So that's the basic idea of clean free market policy is let's, you know, really explore what those barriers are and target policies that take down those barriers. But there's another crucial piece on this, and this is where we started, which is that the most obvious barrier and the most obvious, opportunity is that when you have profits, you have taxes on the profits. So the tax on those profits is in fact a barrier. Taxes are always a barrier to capital. So if you reduce those taxes on clean technologies that are profitable, you will, you know, accelerate those technologies. So the idea of clean tax cuts, as it was called, was what we led with in terms of exploring public policy. In 2016, we said, look, there's a policy innovation opportunity here. What's the best way to reduce taxes on clean technologies so that it's technology neutral, so that it is, you know, as broad-based as possible, so that it is as effective as possible, so cost-effective as possible. So we explored, you know, starting in 2016, we were very fortunate in that one of the first people who heard this idea when I first announced it in 2016 and said we're looking for partners to work on this was Amory Lovins at the Rocky Mountain Institute. Are you familiar with Rocky Mountain Institute?
I've heard of it, yes.
Yeah, they do great work, and mostly, you know, a lot of their work has not been necessarily policy oriented. They've been really talking to you know, corporations around the world and countries about the benefits of energy efficiency and how this can increase the bottom line, how efficiency makes your company more profitable. And to do this, they've been conducting things called Charettes, right? And Charettes are design exploration meetings where you get, they do this in architecture. You know, it's a French term from the Sorbonne when the you know, students used to put together their year-end projects. They put all their scale model of the cathedral in the 19th century in the cart going to the professor, la charrette. And they'd get into the cart, put the finishing touches. They were said to be en charrette. So this is a term for a expert level group meeting where you design something, usually a building. But in this case, Amory suggested, look, you could use this to design policy rapidly. Get experts together, explore new idea. So we did a series of Charette meetings, starting at Columbia University with Grace Richardson Fund and the Jack Kemp Foundation and people from the right, from the left, all kinds of experts to explore these ideas. And a number of really interesting ideas came out of them. So you're looking for free market, you know, approaches to climate. So clean tax cuts present a range of free market options. And there's a lot, we discovered a lot of ways to do this. It really, you can apply these in many, many different industries, and there are ways to apply them across almost all industries. But would you like me to give you a couple of examples of how clean tax cut ideas might work?
I would like you to do that, but also I think I'd also like you to sort of, when you answer that, really talk about the public appetite for certain policies. Because it's all very well, as you say, having these ideas and policies in theory, but we've also got to think about the politics of it. And I know that you have spoken previously about the public appetite for certain policies. So how could clean tax cuts be presented in a way that would garner support?
Well, you know, in the US context, you know, the truth of the matter is that, liberals, or by that I mean the left in the United States.
Modern liberals.
I know it's different. I know it's different in the UK.
Not classical liberals, modern liberals.
Yeah, the modern, the modern liberals are always bemoaning about how you get, conservatives, involved, and how do you get them to care about the, climate, and and they keep thinking, maybe if we talk about this a different way, maybe they'll. But the basic problem is that, if you're going to lead with a carbon tax, subsidies, regulation, all of this sounds to conservatives like tax and spend and big government, right? Conservatives are allergic to the word tax. So if you want to, if you want a policy to fly with them, add the word cuts, and it'll be much more popular. Tax cuts are very popular with the conservative base in the United States. So I believe clean tax cuts, have a shot in that respect. If we can get past the basic climate denial, which, by the way, I think is a result of those policies that are perceived as left-wing, has provoked in the United States denialism. So it's a question of policies that raise barriers, I think, produce political opposition.
Do you think that's true, or do you think, for example, that one of the things about science has always been about skepticism and challenging knowledge. If knowledge had not been challenged in the past, we would not have made progress. And surely skepticism is a natural part of science. And there will always be skeptics when someone goes on TV and announces the science has been settled, as it were. So they're not necessarily anti-environmental, they're just very skeptical about some of the science that's been presented. They might still.
Oh, I know. I think that you're absolutely right, and I mean, it's entirely possible that climate change is real and it's been hyped. So both things could be true, and I believe they probably are. I stay out of that end of the debate because I'm not a scientist. I'm just saying, if this is a real problem, here are some solutions to it. And even if it's, the Grace Richardson Fund and the Smith Richardson Foundation before that had a basic policy strategy, which is that when there is a concern about something, you address that concern with a free market solution. It doesn't really matter if the concern is ridiculous. If you have a free market solution that reduces barriers and expands freedom, it's a net win for freedom. So these policies that I'm talking about, reducing taxes will be beneficial to the economy. This is a no regrets policy. This is in terms of economic growth, no regrets. To remove barriers, you're not, you have to be careful about the budgetary costs, but I think we have some ideas that are affordable. But so let me give you a couple of examples of actual clean tax cuts and how they'd work so you understand them better. There's two basic kinds. One is on the equity side and the other is on the debt side. So in equity, the first great example of a clean tax cut proposal, was the suggestion that you could do this really well in the automobile industry. This was suggested even at the first, charrette, because in the automobile industry in the United States, you have really good metrics. It's well understood what sustainability means. It means lower emissions, right? And you can measure that. You can reduce it to one number: the average vehicle fleet emissions. So you could take that one number for every automobile manufacturer, and the lower, or even automobile retailer for that matter, and the lower the fleet emissions, the lower the tax rate, right? So you could peg the two, and you could apply it to business income tax, you could apply it to investor income tax. And because in an automobile company, at least in the United States, everybody from the boardroom to the shop room floor has an equity package in that company. They have stock, in their portfolios. The lower the tax rate on that company, the better they do. So you can align corporate culture from the boardroom to the shop room floor with the goal of lower emissions using even a small reward mechanism. 20% off in your taxes if you max out, emissions is a great, reward. So you don't have to give away the farm to do that. So that is, one class of ideas. You can do those kinds of equity tax cuts in the power sector for zero emission power sales, or if you wanted to, refine it, you could do it for zero emission baseload energy, because that's even more, valuable than zero emission power. The difficulty with that, the clean tax cut equity side idea is that for different sectors, it looks different. So it's a kind of, it becomes a little bit of a bespoke policy that you have to figure out how it applies to every sector, and you could certainly do it. But, for instance, in American agriculture, farmers don't pay taxes. We have these elaborate subsidy schemes so that the only people who are paying taxes are the people who sell stuff to the farmers or the people who distribute the food to the customers, right? The farmers themselves, you can't directly incentivize them with this mechanism. So you'd have to do things like, certify what is sustainable agriculture. You'd have to have a certification system so that you could reward the sellers of the products and reward the people who are selling to them. So it becomes a little complicated. You could do it, and certainly I think that proceeding with figuring out certification systems in agriculture will be very important for addressing climate. But when we were looking for, the Charette process involved, in the first year, we did about 8 different Charettes for different sectors of the economy, right? We looked at oil and gas, for instance, and you could certainly apply, clean tax cuts there to reward the deployment of best available control technologies to reduce hydrocarbon emissions at the wellhead and things like that. You could reduce their taxes for, certified facilities, right, and things like that. But one of the things that really the killer app of clean tax cuts we discovered is actually applying it on the debt side. And this was the suggestion of Professor Travis Bradford at Columbia, who is a professor of energy finance. And he said to me, Rod, you're a supply sider and you're all excited about equity side tax cuts. And it's true that the automobile sector, the energy sector have great clean solutions that you could apply. But in fact, they're solutions that are on the demand side of capital. If you take this basic clean tax cut idea and apply it on the supply side of capital to the capital markets, then you're going to have these really interesting double-barreled effects, right? Because for project finance, for instance, if you can, give the, tax-exempt debt, tax-exempt bonds and loans will reduce the cost of capital about 30%, in the US context of tax rates. It might be more than that in Europe, actually. So you can have significant cost of capital reductions, and especially on capital-intensive projects like wind and solar farms. That directly translates into cheaper clean energy. So you're reducing the cost of your clean energy 25%, which means that you're increasing the demand for the clean energy because it's cheaper. You're increasing the supply. You're simultaneously increasing supply and demand at the same time, right? So both are going up. And you're also doing something really interesting, because this is not just an ordinary supply side tax cut. This is a leveraged supply side tax cut. You're applying a supply side tax cut to leverage. That means you're leveraging up return on equity. Leverage is what capitalists use all the time to increase their return on equity, whether they're doing, trading on margin or project finance for that matter. So That's why people use debt instead of equity to do project finance, because it's cheaper than raising more equity, right? So if you decrease that cost of capital even further, you're increasing the return on equity. And that means that you're attracting investors, not just to the tax exempt debt, but also to the taxable equity. Now, in the U.S. in the U.S. context, what that means is, you're giving up the tax expense where the returns are low, because in the U.S., return on debt, average return on debt is about 4%. It's probably even lower than that right now. And return on equity over the, before coronavirus was around 13.6. So it's much higher. So if you have a capital stack on a project, which is 50-50 debt to equity, right? You're getting 340% more tax revenue on that equity than you're getting on the debt. And these projects, by the way they do them in the United States, at least, every project is a new company. Yeah. Every project is a new company. So it's new equity, new debt. So you're getting more tax revenue than you're giving up in tax expense by doing it. It makes it an incredibly cost-effective supply side tax cut.
And what's very interesting about your answer here is really about, this is not what you often hear in debates about the environment. It's that, you'd speak to most people, or many people in the environmental movement here, that sounds awfully capitalistic or capitalist. And I thought was interesting earlier on when I was asking about the public appetite for some of your policies. You were saying that in the United States, you've got modern liberals who try to get the support of fiscal conservatives for an environmental agenda. What we find in the UK, and I'm sure you find this to a certain extent in the US, you also have many people in the environmental movement who claim that climate change is a crisis of capitalism, and many of these people are quite often what we call sort of watermelon environmentalists, green on the outside, but really they're using the environmental movement for an excuse to further their Marxist and hard left policies.
Sure.
But I just wonder, how do we address that sort of characterization of it being a crisis of capitalism when in many ways it should be quite neutral, economically or politically neutral. There's no argument, for example, that socialist economies have got a better environmental record. In fact, in many cases, they've got a worse environmental record. So sure. Why the affinity, do you think, between environmentalism and socialism, or in the US, the affinity between environmentalism and modern liberalism? Shouldn't these environmentalists be neutral? And what challenges does that present for someone like you who says, hey, I've got a free market solution to all this?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that the part of the problem is, just as you say, is best addressed by pointing out that obviously some of these people are, really pursuing a socialist agenda, with wolves in sheep's clothing. They're looking like an environmentalist because they think it's an opportunity. Here's a problem. We propose a state or command and control solution on this, and look like heroes who are saving the planet. So it is an opportunity, but also we have to recognize is that I think that human beings have a really natural tendency to think, gee, if I were king of the world and I could just tell everyone what to do, all the problems would be solved. And so, that whole, command and control thing, appeals to a certain mind frame that a lot of people have who see themselves as, oh, I'm the hero and I'm going to save the world by telling everybody what to do and commanding everybody what to do. So, and you have to, kind of shake these people up and say, look, everybody wants to be free. So, can you not take away everybody's freedom? So I think that, I have found, though, that there are a lot of people on the moderate left who are willing to listen to these free market ideas. And, honestly, even if they're modern liberals, they are still liberals. They still like free markets. They just want to command them a little bit, but this is maybe a more finesse way to do it. It's a lighter touch. So there's enough policy making in there that interests them, so that I'm finding that it's not a turnoff to people on the moderate left. Maybe extreme socialists, yes, but I've had no problem with people who are not hardline conservatives, for instance, and especially people who are in the renewable energy field, who are the smarter people in that area. Like, for instance, I did a op-ed for Reason magazine with Jigar Shah. Jigar Shah was the founder of Sun Edison. He wrote the No Money Down Solar Playbook, and has since become the host of the Energy Gang podcast. So he's a rock star in the clean energy finance world. He realizes that these ideas are great ideas, and he's not a conservative, I would say, but he's very open to conservative ideas if they work, and he understands, yeah, this is going to work. So we wrote an op-ed on why clean free market policy would actually beat a carbon tax.
Now, we started the conversation discussing the link between coronavirus and the environmental agenda, and you set out some initial thoughts, and you wanted to pin it so we could come back to it at the end of the conversation, having discussed some of your clean free market ideas. Why don't we return to that conversation now? As we round off the conversation, why don't we return to this link between coronavirus and your clean free market ideas?
Well, if I may, there's one aspect of clean free market policy that I would like to explain before I get to the
of course, please do,
thing, because I think it's very important. And I mentioned barriers. We talked a lot about the clean tax cuts, but there's another side to clean free market policy, which is removing barriers to competition. In fact, one of the things that we see is that, probably one of the biggest drivers of climate change, and certainly one of the most unrecognized drivers of climate change, though I was very pleased that one of your previous guests, gave credit to Nigel Lawson for liberalizing the UK power market and how much that had done to decarbonize the UK power system. And in fact, that is absolutely key. In the United States, we have a really interesting social experiment going on, in that, we have some power markets that are competitive and some that are monopoly dominated and uncompetitive. And if you now that those technologies have crossed the tipping point, we're starting to see data that indicates very clearly that the competitive power markets are decarbonizing faster and cheaper than the uncompetitive power markets, even with the mandates and things like that. Places like Texas are doing a better job of decarbonizing at a cheaper price than places like California. So you see that one of the most important, but a key thing to understand is that this problem is more urgent. It's critical in the rest of the world. There are, throughout the developing world, crony-dominated power sectors are delivering dirty, expensive energy when they work. Usually they deliver rolling blackouts and energy poverty. And there are places in Latin America and Africa where, and other parts of the world, where development is simply impossible, because it's a critical path barrier, because you can't build a factory or new housing or a commercial center if there's no power to plug it into, right? So right there, boom, you've killed it. You've killed your economy. And that cronyism that is what it means is that women must be doing their laundry in the river and polluting the river, and they can't be liberated by a washing machine. They're stuck in, menial servitude to the domestic chores. And, women and children primarily are subject to indoor air pollution because of these corrupt power sectors. So, figuring out a way to liberate the power sectors globally would be the biggest climate policy opportunity of this century, right? That's much more important than anything else we can do. So that, the question is, can we address that through trade agreements? Is it possible to think about this through liberating, trade agreements that target anti-competitive barriers, so that we open up power sectors to, competition, not just internal competition, but global competition. So that, this becomes an opportunity for UK companies to develop a wind technology in Latin America, for instance, where they have lots of wind, and coast of Africa, solar in the Sahara. So, and the way these things work together is, if you have a free trade agenda, the most successful, free trade policy push occurred after World War II, right? One of the leading causes of the Depression was, the Smoot-Hawley tariffs in the United States, and the outbreak of tariff wars, trade wars in Europe. Global trade shrank, and it didn't come back until after World War II. And one of the reasons that it came back was that the Marshall Plan, which had some good things about it and some bad things about it, had one very good thing about it. And that is that you could only get these government subsidies, which I don't think the government subsidies were terribly good for the economies that got them, but they were very tempting. And in order to get those government subsidies, you had to agree to free trade. You had to agree to participate in an open market. So the free trade part of the Marshall Plan was key. So one of the things that we can learn from that is that a really good carrot, can help accomplish free trade.
Yeah.
With these clean asset bonds and loans, they could function like a carrot. They could function because if you applied international tax reciprocity on a clean asset bond and loan for environmentally beneficial services, it would create international tax advantage capital flows between different countries and different regions of the world, right? So you could say, hey, let's go into a free trade agreement that's also a clean free trade agreement, removing the barriers to environmentally beneficial goods and services. And guess what? There's a carrot that will be massive international capital flows that are tax advantage for clean development. And that's where the opportunities are for wind and solar. It's not in the UK necessarily, but all over the world. So the most important thing, if you want to tackle climate change, it's got to be a global solution. So one of the things that we've suggested is that there really is an opportunity with the UK and COP26, because you guys have a free trade agenda, right? And so lead COP26 with a clean free trade agenda, right? Clean, and lead it with a carrot, a clean free trade agenda with a carrot attached to it that makes sense, a supply side tax cut. And so instead of doing something stupid like the Marshall Plan did, which was government to government aid, you do private to private investment.
Yes.
So you make the carrot private to private. You don't need foreign aid. We can save money on the foreign aid, stop the government to government aid that we're doing, and do this instead.
So we've talked about two
that's
main
what we
aspects.
so this is what we mean by free market streamlining. You do things that make more sense and get rid of negative externalities, get rid of inefficiencies, do things that cost less. Don't do the traditional subsidies that are incredibly expensive. Do things like clean asset bonds and loans, which are incredibly cost effective. So you have to streamline things. So basically, to get to your question about coronavirus, the proper thing to do is free market streamlining, right? And at this point, I mean, maybe there's an argument that the initial response was, as correct as it could be, given the rapid onset of the thing. That, yes, central bank lending, helps avert a crisis, and Walter Bagehot, your great English economist, was right about that. To avert panic, lend freely, to people with good credit and at high interest rates. Well, we're basically doing that, except some of the lending isn't making a lot of sense because it's at low interest rates. I don't know exactly what you're doing in the UK, but I know in the United States with the Paycheck Protection Program and the Main Street Lending Program from the Fed is and the government are getting into areas they've never been in before. And they're shall we say, taking the basic Bagehot dictum playbook and really going off on some strange tangents. There's, one of the main problems with these lending programs, as I see it, is it's a limited supply of price-controlled debt, right? For both of these programs, the Main Street Lending Program offers interest rates to medium-sized businesses of LIBOR plus 3%, but it's fixed. That means that there's no way for the banks to price risk, right? So and then for the PPP program, it's even worse. They're at 0.5 interest percent. There's, for that program, which is meant to support paychecks, the loans are guaranteed, right, by the Small Business Administration. So there's no incentive to consider solvency of the companies. So these loans are being made to potentially insolvent firms, and in both cases, because there's no way to price risk, the banks for both programs have an incentive to lend to the biggest borrowers, to lend as fast as possible, with in order to get as much money as they can from the loan origination fees they get from the government. So that you get these very perverse designs. So we could do something to replace that. One potential idea that would be much better is, instead of having these fixed low interest rates, use this basic clean asset bond idea, but apply it to the whole economy. To basically say, for a 2-year period, we'll do tax exempt financing, for project finance and everything else that you need it for, and make it very flexible so that they can do it, and it would save you a lot of money. I mean, the Paycheck Protection Program, it costs, to get you, basically $400 billion of loans costs you $400 billion, right? because they're basically, giving the money away.
Yeah.
And they're not even loans. They're basically what they call groans. They're loans that become grants.
Yeah,
Groans,
exactly.
right? So instead of that, for $1 trillion of private lending, with a tax exempt kicker, which gives you very low interest rates, but market interest rates, so the banks can price risk. That means that they're able to, they're able to lend to maybe higher risk, but good businesses, like, for instance, solar deployers and wind deployers, who would be paying an interest rate of 5 or 6%, but now, with the tax exemption, it's down to 3.5 or 4, right? So, you can, but so to do that, $1 trillion worth of lending, the tax cost over, say, for a 5-year program, the loans extend 5 years, that's $33 billion is the tax cost for that. Compare that to the $400 billion for the PPP program. It's much more cost effective.
Yeah.
So you could do things like that to help those people who are ready to start up and who need financing for new projects. This is a great way to do it. But you could also, I think one of the most important things to do is to, I think we should pay a lot of attention to the US-UK free trade agreement. We should prioritize that and make that a model for free trade agreements around the world. So I think that opening up global trade in a big way, getting rid of one of the projects that we're working on with the Reason Foundation is we're going to be doing a charrette on how to include removal of anti-competitive barriers in trade agreements, with a focus on things like power sectors. In fact, that's where we're focusing on. Lynn Kiesling, Michael Giberson I sent you a memo on that. But looking at how to get rid of those trade barriers, those anti-competitive barriers, so that those markets are open to foreign companies coming in, and U.S. companies going to and British companies going to each other's countries and to foreign companies. How do we open up these markets so that players from other countries and from other states can participate? So and I think that there's probably, we're looking at clever ways that we can encourage retail and wholesale competition at all levels. I think getting rid of those, getting rid of these barriers, free market streamlining, and there's a lot of other areas where we can talk about, but that gives you an idea of how you really supercharge an economy, so that the recovery takes off as it did in Germany after World War II.
Well, Rod, that's a wonderful place to end, I think, when you think about a US-UK trade agreement, which is not only good for the agenda of open trade, not only good for our economies, but also good for the environment. Rod, thank you very much for joining us today. It's been a fascinating discussion. And what's really interesting is that anyone who's been listening will understand about your discussion about clean free market, clean tax cuts, the use of capital markets and financial instruments. Anyone who has any doubt that capitalists or people who believe in free markets do not care about tackling some of the environmental problems will be left in no doubt that they were wrong before now. So can I thank you, Rod, for joining us today. Can I thank everyone out there who's watching or listening? Don't forget to check out the previous episodes in our Zero In series. All of these can be found on our YouTube channel, IA London. For more details of all our online content and to stay updated on our activity, please visit our website, ia.org.uk. Check out our YouTube channel, IA London. Check out our podcasts on Podbean, or subscribe to our IA Daily. And also, to help keep us providing free content during these tough times, please do consider making a contribution, no matter how modest, by donating online at ia.org.uk. Thank you very much to all our donors. Thank you very much to our listeners and our viewers today. Thank you, Rod, for joining us. Thank you all for watching or listening today, and we hope that you'll join us again soon.